The practice of pistol dueling left an indelible and tragic mark on early United States history. Here are just a few of the examples. In 1804, then Vice President Aaron Burr challenged former Secretary of State Alexander Hamilton to a duel. Burr charged that Hamilton had made some despicable remark about Burr, otherwise unspecified, and Burr demanded that Hamilton either retract the remark or issue him an apology. The two eventually met in a secluded spot in Weehawken, New Jersey, on the banks of the Hudson River in July of 1804, and the result was that Alexander Hamilton was shot and died in agony from a bullet wound in the spinal column several hours later. In 1806, future President Andrew Jackson challenged a political rival of the time, Charles Dickinson, to a duel. Jackson charged that Dickinson had made some disparaging comments about Jackson's wife being an adulteress. Apparently, Rachel Jackson's divorce from her previous husband had not been finalized properly, and she was still legally married when she married Jackson. Jackson took umbrage at the remarks, challenged Dickinson to a duel, and in May of 1806, the two faced off with pistols. Jackson was wounded in the chest but survived. Dickinson died also in agony several hours later. The situation between Commodore Stephen Decatur and James Barron was much more complicated. In 1807, then Captain James Barron was in command of the USS Chesapeake when the ship encountered the HMS Leopard. The situation clearly got beyond Barron's control. His command and control of his ship disintegrated, and he was forced to surrender his ship and crew to the HMS Leopard. Barron was court-martialed, and among the officers of his court-martial was then Captain Stephen Decatur, once a former subordinate officer of Barron's. Decatur reluctantly but ultimately agreed with the board's decision to suspend Barron from the Navy for 5 years without pay. Barron was eventually reinstated to a desk job, but his career remained under a cloud, and several times he attempted to have his record reinstated. Over the years, Decatur became more and more opposed to this, and eventually in 1820, Barron felt obliged to challenge Decatur to a duel. In March of 1820, the two met in a field near Bladensburg, Maryland, Decatur, and faced off with pistols. James Barron was severely injured in the leg, an injury that would affect him the rest of his life. Stephen Decatur was hit and died in agony a few hours later. Pistol dueling was carried out according to a prescribed set of rules, and the rules that these men would have been familiar with and would have been using was something called the Code Duello, or specifically the Irish Code Duello, or the Irish Code. This had been drawn up as a list of 26 rules by a group of men in Ireland in 1777, describing themselves as the gentlemen of 5 counties of Ireland who had met at the assize meetings in County Clonmel to develop a code of rules related to pistol dueling. Now, while it sounds like these gentlemen had a lot of time on their hands to waste doing silly things, actually they had a very serious point. The idea of dueling or satisfying one's honor by a force or encounter with arms dates back to the Middle Ages, to the Code of Chivalry. A man's honor, his personal prestige, his personal reputation, and the perception both of himself and that of other people, most importantly, that he was of the upper ranks of society, was paramount. His honor was his most prized possession, and any gentleman would defend his honor with his life and challenge any insult to it to a duel. For many centuries, these duels took place with swords and later on foils. There were elaborate codes of conduct as to how to give and receive a challenge, what weapons could be used, what strokes were outlawed, and the like. Because many of these codes originated in Renaissance Italy, where the term for dueling was duello, the code became known as the Code Duello. Beginning in the 18th century, however, people were dueling less and less often with swords and more with pistols. Dueling pistols soon became an accessory for every gentleman. Every gentleman either owned one or knew a friend, a relative, or a colleague who did. Dueling pistols were custom made. They were exactly identical twin pairs of single-shot pistols, usually very elaborately worked by specially trained gunsmiths. They were made to fire single shots, fire quickly, and fire accurately, and they usually fired very large caliber ammunition, such as musket balls. Because they were used at close quarters and fired large caliber ammunition with such accuracy, a dueling pistol could be as deadly as a modern handgun. For this reason, the gentleman of County Clonmel, Ireland in 1777 decided that a more elaborate set of rules relating to the preliminaries of an armed encounter had to be drawn up. Contrary to popular belief, the idea of a duel was not to kill somebody, although that is oftentimes what happened. The idea was for the injured or aggrieved party to receive the satisfaction of knowing that he had faced his enemy's fire or his enemy's weapon in full and fair combat. Hence the term often used in duels to demand satisfaction. There are several different terms in dueling to use to describe parts of the process. Most people refer to duels politely as affairs of honor. However, more properly, the term affairs of honor related to the preliminaries when either the principals or their seconds would attempt to reach a settlement that would leave them short of having to actually go on to the interview, which was the armed encounter with pistols on a field of honor. According to the Code Duello, a injured or an aggrieved party who believed that his honor had been insulted in some way would go to the party or the person that he believed had usually spread some rumor or made some accusation in a speech or a letter to the editor or at a party or the like, and demand that the person retract the remark and make an apology. Although apologizing and backing off was technically an option, it was rarely used, because now the aggrieved party's honor was at stake. The aggrieved party could not be perceived by his friends and colleagues as having engaged in honor unbecoming a gentleman by asperging or by insulting the honor of another. Thus, the aggrieved party would often deny the charges and sometimes issue a complaint of his own, which would lead eventually to a countercharge. If the initial complaint was not answered in a satisfactory manner, the two men would then engage seconds, sometimes relatives but usually trusted friends or colleagues whose tact and discretion could be relied on. The seconds would attempt to arrange a written retraction and apology, usually the one that would be published later on in a newspaper or at least somehow preserved for posterity, that both settled the aggrieved party that believed he had been insulted without damaging the honor and reputation of the person that might have done the insulting. Only if these preliminaries were not successful in reaching a settlement did an actual challenge ensue. Despite the common scene in movies and novels where the person walks up to the offending party, the aggrieved party walks up to the offending party, slaps him on the face with a glove, and demands satisfaction, generally these requests for an interview were also delivered in writing. It then became the job of the seconds to arrange the preliminary and important necessary practical matters leading up to the actual duel. The aggrieved man had his choice of weapons, this is true, but it was usually assumed that he would use his own dueling pistols or that of someone that he knew within his family or circle of friends. The seconds would also select the time and the place of the duel. The place of the duel was usually a secluded spot far away from the eyes of anybody who might pass by and see what was going on, or particularly from the eyes of any constable or other law enforcement. Dueling was, after all, a crime, and although it was generally never convicted or charged or convicted, it still counted as a lesser form of murder, usually manslaughter. Thus, it was important for the utmost secrecy and discretion to be used. Many duels took place at sunup when there was enough light to see by. However, others took place early in the morning when it was still dark, and the participants sometimes used lanterns to make their shots. Hence, in early depictions of the duel, a lantern is often seen as being present as part of the scene, and that is why. The seconds would also arrange for a doctor to be available and would arrange for the desired number of paces for the combatants to face each other. 10, 20, or 30 paces were common. Usually the more egregious the offense, the closer the combatants would stand to one another. Again, contrary to what is often depicted in movies and in novels, the principals themselves did not usually stand back to back with their pistols and walk their paces. More often than not, the seconds had done so and had predetermined the marks that each person would stand on. On the day of the duel, the seconds would arrange for the doctor to be present and would then accompany their respective principals to the dueling field, where usually the marks had been set up. The next job of the seconds was to inspect the pistols, make sure that they were in proper working order, that they were loaded with the exact same amount of powder, with the exact size caliber of ball, and determine whether the principals wished their pistols to be set to a hair trigger. Many dueling pistols had a small mechanism that could allow the pressure of the trigger pull to be lightened, thus making the gun more quicker and easier to fire in an instant. The two principals would then take their positions and wait for the seconds command to commence their firing. There were 3 ways to do this: simultaneous fire, or by choosing, usually by flip of a coin, who would fire first. Sometimes the aggrieved party would fire, sometimes the offending party would get the first fire. Although it's often depicted as the signal being a drop of a handkerchief, more practical and more used often were verbal commands. When the seconds would call present, the principals would step to the mark, turn their sides to their opponent, leaving as lean a profile as possible for a mark, and one by one deliberately take their shots. It's because of the stance that they were standing with their profile to their opponent that both Decatur and Hamilton were so severely wounded in the side, the bullets lodging in the spinal column, an extremely agonizing and ultimately gruesome death. Once the affair was over, the doctor, who had been standing just out of sight of the duel, would then be called in to administer to anyone who was injured, and both seconds would quickly arrange to get the two principals out of the area as soon as possible, just in case the noise of the gunshots had alerted any passing policemen or others who would come on the scene. The doctor always stayed just out of sight of the duel so that he could not be called as a witness at the inevitable coroner's inquest. And because the seconds were also sworn to secrecy, technically there were no witnesses, which is why there were very few prosecutions of dueling in the early age. If both combatants had acted honorably, the matter was considered settled, and usually later on the two seconds would meet and drop their own official account of the duel, which may have been used at an inquest or later on in a newspaper, or was in some way preserved for posterity, so that all sides and both families could be assured that these two combatants had acted like gentlemen and done what they were supposed to do. After Hamilton's death in 1804, and particularly after Decatur's death in 1820, public outcry arose against dueling, and law enforcement and the courts began to crack down harder on duelists. Also, people began to see moral reasons against dueling, and more people, particularly in the northern states, were apt to refuse a challenge and resort to lawsuits to correct their insulted honor. However, in the United States South, where an aristocracy class still very much existed and still very much played by the old rules, the dueling remained a very common and accepted method of settling and avenging insulted honor, if not an absolute mania in the states below the Mason-Dixon line. In 1838, John Lyde Wilson, a former governor of South Carolina, came up with a dueling code which would force reluctant participants to take part in a duel, and at the same time try to avoid, wherever possible, law enforcement discovery. A gentleman who refused the challenge to a duel could be called out by having the details posted either in a newspaper or in a handbill. That's almost forcing that he would have to come out onto the field of honor to defend himself and his family, or family name. Lloyd Wilson recommended that duels take place in the early morning, before it was light, in secluded places such as an island in a river or a sandbar in a river, so that jurisdiction between two counties or between two states would be a murky detail, and perhaps both counties or neither state would be persuaded to prosecute, and that the parties and the seconds be sworn to utmost secrecy and silence about what had happened. Dueling remained a feature of life in the upper class of the United States South up until the time of the Civil War, reaching its most ridiculous zenith in the 1850s, in the years leading up to the Civil War, with bitter political debates about secession and slavery. It would take the carnage of the Civil War to persuade people that dueling was a waste of life and was an extremely ridiculous way to defend one's honor. Whether or not the duel is an ancestor or a forerunner of the Wild West shootout is material for another clip. But needless to say, it's definitely posed a few tragedies in the early history of our republic.